My name is Charlene Wadwana. I'm the curator for the talk series Growing Focus. Thank you. And we have a full auditorium at 11:30 in the morning. That's all I care about. Thank you so much for being here with us. Okay, a bit about the program and a bit about the panel. The India Art Fair talk series Growing Focus is generously supported by JSW. We're examining the increasing prominence of South Asia within contemporary art and culture. The entire series highlights the efforts of people of the global majority comprising more than 80% of the world's population, with roots in indigenous African, Asian, and Latin American cultures who are asserting their presence across arts and cultural ecosystems. Amid the ongoing decentering of dominant global north narratives, it frames this moment not merely as a response to decolonization, but as landmark historic self-determination. We explore this impact for audiences today and every day. All talks are conducted in Indian Sign Language, so let's give it up for my colleague on the left. Some talks are translated live in Bengali, Tamil, and Hindi in the coming days. Our panel today is the Diasporic creator, insider, outsider. Artists and curators often must contend with thinking about home from all the non-homes they occupy. How does this impact their practice? How do they accommodate the aspects that get missed in translation? The smells, the sights, the touch, the taste, and the nuances of home. This panel brings in this delicate balance of keeping this diasporic lens and looking from the outside in, whilst maintaining creative integrity towards what they create. How does this movement impact their practice is crucial to unpack, since they are or aren't, or are made to be, or may be, the representatives of diaspora wherever they are. This panel aims to unpack these complicated matters about home, belongingness, straddling multiple hyphenated identities through the lens of artists, curators, gallerists, championing those curators that embody this. A little bit about the panel that we have here today. Anoushka Mirchandani, just going to have you say a hi. Yeah. Earned her BA from Denison University and studied painting at City College, San Francisco. The artist was born in Pune, India, and currently lives and works in New York. She deploys her painting practice as an act of agency, locating and relocating aspects of identity in new contexts under novel circumstances. Sagarika Sundaram creates cultural textiles using raw and natural fibers and dyes, a graduate of Parsons, the New School, New York, and National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad. Her work has been exhibited at the Bronx Museum, Chicago Architecture Biennale, and the British Textile Biennale. Her solo exhibition at Nature Mod Delhi runs till February 23rd, 2025, and I've gone and seen it, and you all need to. Shaunak Mahbubani is a... Say hi. Is a curator-writer based between Berlin and Mumbai. They explore possibilities of co-visioning futures grounded in the pursuit of non-duality. From 2017 to 2023, they curated Allies for Uncertain Futures, featuring over 100 artistic contributions across 7 international locations. Other recent projects also include Wrapped in Shadow of Freedom, Kosovo 24, Disrupting Protected Ignorance, curated with Sajjan Mani at the Hakavi Berlin in 2024, the Albanian Conference, the 4th Lagos Biennale, and Parag Tandale quite recently at Turk in 2023. Rajiv Kannan Menon is a Los Angeles-based gallerist and the founder of Rajiv Menon Contemporary. I can't wait to go and see it in person. He earned his PhD from New York University, where he studied global media and visual culture. In May 24, Rajiv was honored by the city of Los Angeles for his contributions to the city's art scene. And tying it all together is the moderator for today, Jasmine Wahi, founder and co-director of Project for Empty Space. She's a curator focusing on international feminism, femme empowerment, and cultural identities. Honored by the Met for Social Impact in 23, she teaches at Brooklyn College and serves on boards blending academic, curatorial, and social advocacy in the arts. I give it over to her to tie and unpack this together. The mics are right there for all of you.
Thank you.
Push to talk right underneath the mic to just double click. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Oh.
I've done mine wrong. Hold open. Aha. Hello. Ha ha ha. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Okay. If I can get over the jet lag, you can say good morning. Come on. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us this morning. So we have an illustrious panel of culture makers here, from artists to gallerists to curators. And I think before I jump into my softball then hardball questions, I would love it if each of you could introduce yourselves with your own introduction, because I think it's one thing to hear sort of a formal written bio, but if you could tell us a little bit about your practice and, two-parter question, and how you see yourself fitting within the diaspora, understanding that the term diaspora is not actually a monolithic identity.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rajiv Menon, and I'm the founder of Rajiv Menon Contemporary, which is one of the few gallery programs in the U.S. that's focused on South Asia and the diaspora. I'm based in Los Angeles. We're actually opening a new space in Hollywood in 8 days, very soon. And I really want to find ways to bring South Asian visuality into conversations with the larger culture. And for me, my position in the diaspora, having largely grown up in the States, having spent most of my life positioned there, is an opportunity to interlocute between spaces. And I think that's going to be one of the big themes we talk about today. I want to think about how my particular placement in the West can be advantageous to the larger cultural ecosystem of South Asia. And that's very much my mission, and I know it's shared with so many people here, and really kind of the spirit I want to bring to this conversation as well as the work that I do.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for coming out early in the morning. My name is Shaunak Mahbubani. I work as a curator and a writer. And I think the space that I really enjoy about curating is the polyphonic conversation, to work with artists who come from multiple backgrounds, who come from spaces that I can also learn from our dialogues, that there's bringing in new perspectives where we're learning from each other, we're learning of ways to imagine futures that are equitable across the board. For me, I live in Berlin now. I've lived in a few different cities, but I'm not fully sure I identify with the term diaspora as it sits. But at its core, this question of belonging has been very pivotal to my experience. I grew up as in a Sindhi family in Maharashtra, and there's always been this negotiation of cultural dissonance. What's outside and what's inside the house is always having a kind of tension with each other. And this recognition of a sort of constructed boundary between the self and the other has become a core part of my practice, to understand what creates this boundary, but then also through my own practice in Buddhist philosophy, to understand how we might be able to expand this boundary. How do we think about self as beyond just the physical body or the family, into broader social groups, into ecology, into technology? Can we have kinship with AI? Is it possible to think in those lines? Thinking about how some of these contradictions also come together. What are the possibilities of holding these kind of polarities together, and what new meanings come from this possibility of bringing together opposites? A little bit about my practice.
Hi, my name is Sagarika Sundaram. I work mainly with fiber, and it's handmade wool felt. It's a textile that I make from scratch. I dye the wool, and what I'm really focused on right now is making these layered compositions that I love breaking the surface of the fabric. So I like cutting the fabric open and having pockets and hiding patterns inside layers. So there's I have a work at the Nature Mort booth at the fair, and then as Charlene said, I also have a solo exhibition on at the Dhan Mill compound at Nature Mort, where I'm showing my first mosaics made with glass tile. So there's that relationship between hard and soft that's coming into the work. But it's abstract, it's colorful, it's wild, it's very open to interpretation and association. And I think in the same way, labels, I also don't really, I think at different points in my life, I've been less and more diasporic. I grew up in Dubai. My parents moved there in 1979. My father moved there and then my mother joined later. But I went to boarding school in India when I was 11, and then I did undergrad in Ahmedabad at NID. So I feel very connected and fortunate that I had an arts education rooted here. And I live in New York now. And in a way, I feel despite all of the kind of, visa things and stresses, but I feel like it's, I feel very fortunate overall because one can tap into the best of, there's so much on offer. I think one helps the other in a way, and one context helps the other. Being in New York, I experienced my work, just my practice really explode open in a way that I didn't anticipate, and I'm very grateful for. There's so much kind of energy there and people wanting to help artists at all levels, and that's what I experienced when I moved there. But I will also say that it's wonderful being here. I feel very connected it's my first India Art Fair. The energy is great. Everybody wants to have a good time. Everybody's excited about the art. And so it's really lovely to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Anoushka Mirchandani. I'm an artist based in San Francisco right now, but originally from Pune. And my practice really looks at themes of assimilation, migration, movement, and how, identity is a continuous evolution, and we're always kind of reassembling and renegotiating identity as we move through different social, environmental spaces, and it's always in momentum and never in stasis. And so, one of the biggest parts of my practice is delving into my family history, specifically my matrilineage, so my nani and my dadi stories. They, were displaced during the partition of India, and it was a history that we really never talked about as a family until only a few years ago. And so it has been really interesting to kind of build a family archive with photos, documents, interviews to really kind of uncover some of these hidden histories. And then at the same time, kind of investigate my own journey when I moved to the States from India when I was 18, and had this a really deep longing to kind of fit into a new society. And it took me a few years to really start asking the bigger questions, at what cost and for who? And so really my practice is very much invested in understanding all the nuances of identity. And in terms of diaspora, I feel very similarly with the label. It's fraught with some contention for me because some days I feel like I'm an Indian artist living in America, and then some days I feel like I'm an American artist longing for home. So, it's kind of confusing and it kind of moves through different shapes and sizes as well. And sometimes I also feel like diaspora is this word that's just an easily digestible word, and it kind of... Thanks. Oh, okay, I think... Oh, different. Okay. So, yeah, I think it's just I don't, feel connected to that label because I think it's just another way to be legible and digestible in a really gray area.
Well, I think that is sort of a segue into some of my questions for the artists, the makers, and the ways in which legibility is important or not important outside of this context being here in India, as being part of the diaspora or displaced from a homeland. Anoushka, since you have the mic, can you talk a little bit about how important, well, first, I think how people interact with your paintings in these dual contexts. And then the second part of that question is how important is legibility within those two contexts?
So, for me, I guess I don't have a specific expectation of how I desire people to react or engage with the work. But I think people have expectations of me, of how the work is supposed to be sometimes. So, for example, I'll have people that come to the studio, and when they engage with my work, they sometimes say, "Oh, I can't tell that you're Indian when I look at your work." And I'm like, well, what's Indian work supposed to look like? We're a country of like 1 billion plus people, 1,000 plus languages, so many cultures and community. What exactly is Indian work supposed to be? And so I also feel like the act of creating is so like vulnerable in of itself that I don't think it's my duty or responsibility as an artist to have to spoon feed any of like the layers or complexity to an audience. Although I always appreciate it when people ask and want to know.
I think there's something, speaking about legibility, there's something about the handmade and kind of craft-based work that I found that whether somebody's, kind of people from societies or cultures that still have a pre-colonial, pre-industrial memory, like Peru, places in South America, parts of Indonesia, parts of Africa. People really connect with my work because, and you know, I was so excited to have a show in India. I've been making work for about 5 years because even, I think on some level, everybody here has a relationship to textile, or some kind of, you know, hand thing, whether they like it or not. It's an imprint in the kind of DNA in South Asia, across South Asia. And I think the work is read differently here, or read, I don't know. And I kind of wanted to see how that would play out. I think when I show in the West, it's a different read. I also get the same, oh, your work doesn't look so Indian, which is, whatever, you know. It's just kind of these silly sort of projections. People want you to present a certain way. But yeah, I think that, you know, on the subject of legibility, I like how the handmade cuts across. And I think in the work, there's a relationship between the body and nature that I have, since making, you know, the work, have kind of spotted across classical poetry, so Sangam literature, across miniature painting and music. So it's a recurring sort of idiom or source or relationship. And I think that it's kind of wild for me to see it in my work, because then that's the connection that I see to the source, the here, you know, that relationship. And I think that even if in the modern day we don't maybe consciously think, oh, Indian art has that strong relationship, or South Asian art doesn't have that at its heart, I do think we carry an affinity for it just because we've been, or the audience here has been exposed to that, whether they like it or not. And, you know, whether it's in Bollywood music or in any kind of cultural sort of, it carries that, some of that, you know, because Bollywood is basically folk music and all of that, you know. So I'm still learning about how my work is legible and how and by whom, and observing and making sense of it.
Yeah, and I guess a very quick follow-up to that question is how, because your work is more abstract in its form and also not in its materiality, but it is mixed media to some extent, how important is it for you as the artist for people to know your heritage or background? Because there is a language of abstraction that I think transcends a cultural specificity.
I think it's not important. My favorite audience is young children, and my background is completely irrelevant to them. And I really love when people ask me, it's usually adults ask me, what does this mean? But it's children who come and say, I see this, I see that. And that's that's the kind of innocent sort of response that I think all abstract work offers the possibility for. And I love that. So no, I don't think it's important to me. Yeah.
So this is a question for all of you, actually, but now I want to start with the curator and gallerist. Who is your work for? And this is like such a rudimentary question that professors always ask in art school, or if they're good professors, they should. But yeah, who is your work for?
I think my work is for everybody, and very specifically, I frame my mission as not only bringing South Asian art to the wider Western art contemporary landscape, but bringing South Asian people in the West to the contemporary art landscape broadly. I want to create a cultural movement around South Asian visuality. I look to other forms of cultural expression. I think about in music, Afrobeats and reggaeton and K-pop, and the way that there have been these major cultural movements that have come out of other parts of the global south, the non-Western world, that have become so deeply globally dominant now. And the way that's happened is through active dialogue between the homeland and the diaspora. I don't think those boundaries can be fixed, because without that fluidity across those boundaries, we can't have these larger forms of cultural revolution. Like, truly, I think about the ways that Indian visuality can be broadly shaping global imagination, and that isn't limited to one audience. It truly is for everyone. When I see the way that people in Los Angeles respond to the gallery, people who have never really studied, been to South Asia, known that space, are not that familiar with the culture, when it's contextualized for them correctly, they immediately, through the specificity of the work, find incredible forms of universal relevance. There's so much opportunity to see yourself in ways that you couldn't have possibly imagined, because work coming out of South Asia is so fundamentally culturally relevant. Not only, the aesthetics that we're bringing forward that can be appreciated by anyone, but the social thematics we're interested in, thinking about themes of migration, assimilation, political precarity, our climate. These are things that affect everybody. Yes, they're being expressed in very particular languages often that are coming from our social experiences, but they are by no means limited to just one group. And I think, especially in the West, where so often we're expected to pigeonhole ourselves, the system of American multiculturalism in particular really does think about culture in very discrete categories. And I want to create frameworks where we can absolutely embrace the specificity, the texture, the uniqueness of South Asia as a place, while reaching the widest audience possible. And when I see the fair, I see this shared global ambition to make South Asian art a global phenomenon. We're so excited to see so many international visitors, to see booths from all over the world. And for that to happen, we have to have people on the ground interlocuting, talking to broader audiences, making sure that there's that constant active translation. And with that, I really do hope to see this type of phenomenon on a global scale.
I think for me it's really important to think about the specific audience that relates to each project. It's very important to contextualize who a project is talking to, speak to a larger audience, but motivate its thematics, motivates its arrangements towards those that are within the focus of the project. When I was invited to Kosovo, which is in the Balkans, it's a recently independent country, I was invited to think about queer advocacy in Kosovo. And we brought together 20 queer positions from the Balkans and international artists of color, including Ra, Nakwi, and the Queer Muslim Project from South Asia. That exhibition was focused towards an affirmation for trans and queer people in the region. And that was the best responses that I got from there. When I was invited to co-curate with Sajan Mani a project at House of World Cultures in Berlin, there we wanted to provoke within this institution that is decolonial, that thinks from this very specific radical politics. We wanted to poke a hole in the kind of monolith that South Asians are seen as, especially in Berlin or at Europe at large. The brown identity is seen as kind of one monolithic identity without understanding the nuances of caste, of regionalism, of different kinds of gender histories as well. And for there, it was really important within this institution that has been very white, has been very Brahminical. It was really important to bring in anti-caste artists who who speak from a lived experience, to take over the foyer of the institution, for example, with a portrait of Rohit Vermula by Rahi Punyashloka, to think about the way that spatiality as well interacts with how people understand these topics. I think for me to think very particularly is at the core of my practice.
I actually had questions for you about both of those shows. So I want to start with Wrapped in the Shadow of Freedom. And if you can talk a little bit about first of all, just describe the show for those who may not be familiar with it. And then can you talk a little bit about the importance of inclusivity of artists of color from across the world in speaking to, I think, a global community or an attempt at creating global camaraderies in the face of, if we're going to be candid about it, really rabid conservatism, particularly against queer and trans folks?
For sure. So this was a show where I was invited by a queer advocacy group called Sekhmet Institute to put together in Kosovo to think about what queer freedoms, what are the possibilities, what are the complexities, what are the contradictions also contained within queer freedoms. And what we looked at very importantly was this dichotomy between visibility and safety. In our social media generation, in who's getting to be seen on exhibition lists, who's getting to be seen at the fair, there's a certain kind of promise that visibility is going to give us a certain social mobility, or it's going to give us a certain access to rights. But what often happens is those who are on the vanguard of this visibility framework are those who are getting the most amount of violence thrown at them. You're putting yourself out there, you're making yourself, in a way, flattened, legibly, but flattened, and you're making yourself more susceptible to different kinds of violence. And so this was at the core of the explorations within this show. But because the Balkans is on the borderlands of Europe, it's so proximate to the kind of circulations of Berlin, of Paris, of London. There is, and we also see it here in a lot of ways, it is a hangover of colonialism. We have an aspiration towards these places. There is a kind of validation that comes when you do something in Europe or in the US. And I think to poke holes in that, to say that that aspiration is largely a kind of hangover that doesn't take us very far, because in the end you're in these places, but you're still seen as somebody who is not from there, who doesn't belong and will most probably never belong, because you come with a different sensibility. And what I find really exciting is to mobilize some of these locations, to mobilize some of these funding structures in ways that we can have conversations with regions that are much more proximate culturally to us. When I spent time in Mexico City, I found that it was so much more similar to Delhi than I could ever imagine. The way that kinship systems, the way that there's warmth, the way that people invite you into their houses, this is something that I never feel in the US or in Europe. And I think to have those kinds of conversations through our arts infrastructures, through bringing artists of color into spaces, like we got Wabene Elikam Fiatsi, who's an artist from Ghana, to do a performance in Kosovo, and a lot of people there have never seen a black artist speak so eloquently about issues that concern all of us. And so I really think there is a possibility to re-instrumentalize these networks that often constrict us, to say, how can I subvert this? How can I poke a hole in their own ways of functioning to do what feels good for me, to build a kind of solidarity kinship network across the world.
Thank you for that. Oh, did you want to say? Oh. And now I've just forgotten my other question. I wanted to... What did I want to ask you? I wanted to ask those of us who are living... I'm trying to think about how to frame this question in a politically correct way. Is there any sense of discomfort for the two of you as artists who are now living in the States, and actually, I would say even for us, given the not so new but maybe more prominently projected climate that is happening in the place that we live now? Is there any sense of needing to diminish yourself or squash yourself for fear of repercussion from said climate?
Sometimes I have been told, around the...
It's very hard to speak around this.
If I, say something about the elections, the American elections, I'm told, or I'm politely and gently, it's communicated to me, or I have to say it myself. Well, I'm not from here, so it's not even something I should comment about. So I need to make these sort of excuses or just hedge what I say in personal conversations with artist friends who are from America and kind of bristle at criticism or commentary about what's happening. But then, that makes me think about how do I respond if people talk about what's happening here. People mostly have questions. People have, questions about the political climate and how it is. And, the question is, do I have to minimize myself in any way? I have to think about that. Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I think you also bring up an interesting point about suddenly becoming a spokesperson, which I'm curious about actually for all of us, because that is a big part of being a part of diaspora, for lack of a better term. But Anoushka, go ahead.
I think there is this demand for us as artists to be vocal about our views online, etc. And I kind of feel the same way, where I've had to hedge certain questions. But, right now, at the same time, as a newly minted American citizen since 2023, I feel also kind of a shared responsibility to that culture and community. And so that has been kind of a new relationship for me to navigate, where previously I could be like, oh, I'm not from here, I don't belong here. And now I feel like I have to somehow take some responsibility for my own navigation of how I move through America, given that I have a voice, or kind of, in the country now. So still figuring that out.
I've been asked by people there, how are you so confident? And, I think sometimes in some situations...
Versus what?
I know. People are not used to seeing, like you said, an eloquent person. But then also I say, I'm a product of a post-colonial society. I studied English. I have privileges that have enabled me to be legible in a certain way in this society, that help me move, class privileges and caste privileges that, help me, that are in my toolkit. So that's just all part of it, And so there's a little bit of a resentment sometimes from some people, but I am just what I am. So, I am... I think all I can do is be responsible about my position and try and kind of, think about who's coming along the way, and, make it. I like bringing people together. I like the collective. I like opening up spaces, and I like all my friends and everybody coming to the party, everybody being there. That's what is the most fun for me. So that's my response.
Thank you. That was a great response. And I think, Rajiv, you and I are in a slightly different position in that we were born in these places, so our relationship with diaspora is somewhat different than the sort of choice and agency to move to a place later as an adult. And so I think the same question for you as, is there any sense of apprehension in trying to create more visibility and conversations and cross-cultural dialogue, which also we're not allowed to say cross-cultural anymore, in the list of banned words. Is there a sense of apprehension as we move forward?
In terms of being a spokesperson? Or in terms of...
I think in terms of being a spokesperson, but also in terms of... thank you. In terms of being a spokesperson, but also as a person who has what I would say in the States is a unique gallery program within the sort of swath of gallery programs, diasporic or not.
I see this as a challenge I want to step up to. I'm trying to actually embrace this position of someone who does have to both speak to the U.S. about South Asian culture, something I really trained for. Like when I went into my PhD program, I was very cognizant that I wanted to think about ways that I could bring South Asian culture in a broad sense into dialogue in the U.S. And I was very, very deliberate about naming the gallery after myself because I wanted to be transparent about that structure of representation. I wanted to be clear that I'm one person, this is my point of view, I can't represent an entire subcontinent, I can't represent an entire diaspora, but here is one position I can present, and maybe I can make a little bit more headway within that. So I do give that caveat, and I'm very clear that I'm specifically from a very specific type of Indian American background. It's limited in terms of worldview in that sense, but nonetheless, that is an important little thing to chip away at and to create more room, hopefully, through my unique perspective. But more than that, lately, I've been feeling a really strong effort to want to bring diasporic perspectives here. In India, I spent a lot of time in India. Before the pandemic, was living in Bombay. I really had a big chunk of my career there. And I've been joking that this is my NRI apology tour this week. Like, truly, I want to try and bring a deeper sense of camaraderie and dialogue between the diaspora and the homeland. And that is something that I really do want to promote through the gallery. Because genuinely, when I'm in India, the question I get asked the most often is, hey, what's the deal with NRIs? Like, truly, there's so much curiosity and a little bit of sometimes apprehension towards the way that culture exists in the diaspora. There is this inherent idea, especially, again, specifically to the US, the idea that we're backwards facing, that we're caught up in a sense of very traditional notion of culture, that we're resistant to innovation. And there is some truth to that. And there is a bit of rigidity in the way that culture is viewed in large swaths of the diaspora. But I also want to demonstrate that some of the most incredible ingenuity and creativity and innovation is coming out of the unique cultural position of diaspora, because we exist in states of simultaneity. We have to constantly contend with so many different types of cultural contexts, not only the cultural context of the place that our families come from, but the place that we've had to settle, and not only code switch, but often exist in so many different modes all at once. So it's something that I think I really want to step up to and try and promote to the best I can. I think about cultural leadership I've seen and who I really admire. One person is Sunny Mehta, who was the publisher at Knopf. He was a major force between the rise not only of literary fiction in the US, but specifically bringing Anglophone South Asian fiction to a global audience. And he very much positioned himself as someone who was able to translate a lot of what people were reading. He was a publisher behind some of the greatest novels we know of the 20th century and beyond. And that effort specifically came from his position within the diaspora, his ability to speak across two different spaces. And I really want to think about how the gallery can be a platform, not just for some of the most incredible, relevant, brilliant visual art that's being made right now, but as a space of exchange between the subcontinent and the West. I think through that project, we could see tremendous cultural opportunity. I know everyone here has this type of ambition to see Indian and South Asian work on a massive global stage, and I think that sense of cultural leadership is essential, because what I fear, and this is to Shaunak's point about sort of the social media generation, within the West there is this focus on visibility, of being seen, of representation in the most literal sort of sense, and what's happened through that is this centrality of social media. If the most important thing is being seen and seeing yourself on screens, then simply going out and making a TikTok becomes an active culture, and I find that very troubling. I think if we're going to have a really, a culture that's evolving and developing and innovative and creating, we have to treat culture rigorously. We have to treat it in a soulful, in a really intellectual, scholarly, and meaningful way. And I want to really try and at least provide a counterweight to where I see other forms of leadership forming that can often be problematic and inadequate. And so I am really trying to take on this challenge, and it's something that I don't shy away from, and hopefully something I can continue to build into the mission of the gallery.
Thank you for that. Also, I would vote for you if you ran for office.
Thank you.
You bring up a really, I think, important point about social media and sort of the culture of social media, single-serving sort of moments of visibility that are in fact very reductive, but have really permeated, I think, our cultures writ large. It's one of the things that is sort of a universal truth across any landscape. And I am curious about a couple things. One is how, as people who are making physical things, across different geographies and places, but things that rely on our tactile engagement with them. So Anoushka, for example, I'm thinking of your works and the ways in which they never translate as well in photographs, in the social media, in the small screen, as they do in real life. And obviously the same goes for your working in three-dimensional spaces. And within the context of exhibition making, what is a strategy to combat where we have come in this reduced way of looking, specifically thinking about the ways in which we, in some ways, reduce ourselves as complex people with multi-positional views because of our cultural backgrounds? Does that make sense? I know that's a very long question. Does that make sense? Shaunak, would you like to start?
The role of exhibition making, I think, has become even more important in this time when we're constantly inundated with images, with video. You're constantly flicking. You're getting 5 minutes somewhere and flicking through images. I don't know, we see 1 million images a week. I think that there is even more, there's a stronger motivation, there's a stronger pressure to make the exhibition an experience. Why is somebody coming into an exhibition space when they can see that documentation, when they can get a virtual walkthrough? Why is somebody coming to an exhibition space? Because you have the ability to hold them for a moment and make them feel something in a multisensorial way. And I think mobilizing that kind of complexity, mobilizing that kind of possibility of the physical, I think is even more important today. And I think when we think about complexity across the board, I think what I've been, it kind of segues a little bit away from your question, but what I've been feeling so much more is that when we give value to artists who come from direct experience, when we give value to artists who speak from their own everyday positions, that complexity, that density of richness is so much bigger. And that is something that actually I feel transcends physical, digital, across the board. I would say it's so amazing to see like Yogesh Barve's installation here, bringing this new media take on these amazing antique-cast texts. And it's nice to see, it's amazing to see artists permeate into galleries, and I would also say for collectors, don't miss out on this. Look for artists who are speaking from their own personal experiences. This is going to be where we're going to go to. This is going to be what is big next. Don't miss out on it.
The question was...
What was your question again? Can we do that? Yeah.
So the question was about how, as makers, for the two of you specifically, as makers, we combat the sort of reductive tendencies of what, and it's not specifically social media, it's more of a pervasive outcropping of what social media has done to us collectively. And so how do you combat that? And I guess I should sort of contextualize a little bit more why I'm thinking about that in the context of visibility. People like us who are often within white spaces, frankly speaking, through these single-serving glimpses of who we are reduced even further. And so how, as artists, do you combat that in your physical making practice? Is there an opportunity for us to turn this reduction around?
I think for me, in my practice, I always found that since we're using the label diaspora for now, let's use it. And I always found that I wanted to kind of, from like the atmosphere, absorb and feel what it meant to be in part of this liminal space. And I found it in film, and I found it in literature. And I wasn't really able to find it in painting, at least for myself. And so I became kind of obsessed with a way to give like visual shape and form to what it feels like to be part of a diaspora, speaking to my own truth. And in that, kind of like resisting a way to fall into like a very specific category, again, of what my work or Indian work or diasporic work is supposed to look like, by really working through my own experiences and creating a visual language that allows me to see myself living across these like multiple global, experiences. And then speaking, specifically to social media as well, I very much have a sort of like toxic relationship with social media. It's like a toxic boyfriend. I feel like sometimes you're being like love bombed, and sometimes you're being like breadcrumbed. And, having to really kind of detach receiving any validation from that medium has been kind of a work in progress for me. And now it's very much like LinkedIn. So I kind of remove a lot of like the personal for myself. And again, like you said, Instagram, for example, really flattens the work. So it's also become an important part of my own practice to really exhibit the work on a global scale, because I really don't believe that America is the nexus of the production of culture at all. And so I really feel...
At all.
Sorry, at all.
The lowest bar.
Was that excessive? But so I really care about, and I'm showing right now at the fair with Gallery Isa. And I've shown with them in Mumbai before. I've shown in New York, in London, in LA, in Berlin. And so I really care about having kind of a global practice, and again, resisting this, idea that the U.S. is like really the center of production.
Yeah, I think, what one communicates over social media, over press, I think we live in this time where artists are expected to explain and speak about their work more than ever and be presentable and be on display. And that is something that is, kind of a sign of success. And so one is expected or incentivized to chase that, but in a way it does give you a bigger audience, to have all of these platforms. But it puts me in a position sometimes where I feel like I might say one thing and that gets blown up as if it was the thesis of everything I said. For example, I had an exhibition in Miami and I made a comment about how I think people use color boldly in Miami, and that became the central thing in the video. And I was like, oh God, I don't really have good feelings about Florida right now, but like politically. So I think, I have, like you, I just have to roll with it. I do think very deeply. I like to think about all of these things as archival and how will this stand the test of time. I don't think all of the things I say, they will age, they will ripen and change, and I will also stand back and, like a telescope, look down and see how things I've said in the past, in a way they're like a diary, everything that,
social media specifically, again, I think it's just now functional for me. I just really don't think that that's the space for nuanced conversation. It's a space that has so much power, but for me, I need a one-on-one conversation. That's what I've just, realized, and that's the space in which I want to talk about complex things. The work does get flattened on social media, but it also gets amplified in social media. I just think my guideline with all of these things, or mantra, is take what's useful, reject what's not, and add your own essence, which is guides me, because it's complicated, to put yourself out there all the time. It's work. It also brings so many wonderful things, but I think the main thing is, to your point, Shaunak, go see the shows in person, because that's where the art lives. It lives in one way on an image. But I do think more and more the image becomes so important because we live in this digital world. So that becomes the first way people get drawn into an exhibition. But it's nothing better than the real thing. So that's just, as art lovers, and even as an art maker, it's like I miss so many shows and I kind of feel very guilty, but that is the most important thing, to go see the show. See shows.
Thank you. So we have about 1 minute left. 1 minute before we do questions, or 1 minute including questions? I'm looking. No one has an answer, so it's okay, we'll do questions. So I wanted to ask this question, but now I'll just sort of leave it as this lingering thought in the air. It's a semantics question. What constitutes being diaspora versus expat versus NR fill-in? And it is a semantic question, but also I think one that's culturally relevant, because, when we talk about decolonizing space, what does it mean to decolonize a space? And a lot of that has to do with language. And then to what extent generationally, how many generations have to pass before you stop being part of the diaspora? And one thing that I'm struck by in this panel is that we don't have any Caribbean artists here, right? Who is sort of part of the original South Asian diaspora to the West. So I guess there isn't time for an answer, but I know, what a rude way to end. You can't answer this question, just leave it in the air. But something to think about is really, when does this label stop for us, regardless of what our positionality or context is within the diaspora? Maybe someone can answer really quickly.
I think of diaspora as a really great umbrella term, and I really lean on it a lot, because I think, yes, it's a literal term for people who have migrated and end up in another place, but where it becomes very productive for me is thinking of it as a cultural positioning. That's less about the physical act of leaving, or like the sort of nuts and bolts of how one got there, and more about that feeling of in-betweenness or simultaneity, or having to exist in multiple places at once. And that becomes this incredible point of entry to cultural possibility, because in that position of diaspora, one has to constantly be creating. You have to create in the act of living to find space in the world, to constantly reimagine new ways of being, and that has created the space for incredible art. So I want to think of diaspora in a very kind of fluid, broad term, because it becomes so helpful and so inclusive in that way. I think when we start thinking about it in very clear demographic terms, it then starts feeling quite stifling, and it becomes a question of who is, who isn't, when I think the possibilities of the more cultural term become endless and much more inclusive in that sense.
And to your point, Rajiv, I also think about expanding in terms of time. I think of my grandparents as diasporic within India, because they moved from Tamil Nadu to Calcutta, and Tamil Nadu to Bihar. So they also had to do exactly what you did, what you said, which is reimagine themselves in a new context. And so I feel like I've had the motion of diasporicness in my family for multiple generations. yeah, I think this idea of expanded ways of thinking about this word is productive.
And that's why I think diaspora is so useful in this context as well, because India is a country defined by migration. It's a country built on the legacy of partition. So many of the people came here, and Anoushka's work looks at this so beautifully, come from elsewhere and landed here and had to rebuild. And I think that kind of notion of coming from one place, even within the nation, is fundamentally diasporic. Same with my family. Coming from Kerala to the north was an experience of migration for my mom's family. And so I think diaspora becomes a really useful framework for us to think and imagine otherwise. Even within the art world, the way we conceive of Indian art as this very national phenomenon is diasporic. Artists like Amrita Shergill and Sohan Khatri and Raza were diasporic in the most literal sense of the word, and yet now often get categorized in purely national terms. But once we start opening that possibility in the aperture of imagination, we can see many, many new ways of looking at the world.
Thank you. Question? No question. Just one question, and then we'll have to close this panel. So any one question from the audience? Right there? Okay.
Quickly took this chance because I don't want to overthink on it. I love this conversation. I learned from all the panelists. My question is to Shaunak that how he started his practice, talking about his practice. It was more like artistic inquiry also, the way artists inquire their practice. So my point, what I learned, what I understood, if I haven't misunderstood, your practice is more around the kind of self and where kind of collective body meets in short. It is also so my question is, when you have own idea of self, how you negotiate with a kind of a practitioner when they have their own baggage of time and space? And also my second question was from the last about the social media. You said wonderful, but my curiosity is to know more that it's not only the image, we are bombarded with the image, it's also the information which is somehow extending the idea of social media. It's a different source from everyone wants to give you a kind of gyan. So information is also my measure, as Sagarika said, that we are supposed to say multiple things. So how you separate artistic practice and a kind of this information or image or the different time. I don't want to talk about the contemporary practice and the kind of social media. Anyway, so these two.
Very briefly, artistic practice, inquiry with the audience.
Thank you. I think that there is a constant negotiation of how we become more permeable. How can we dissolve this boundary? That there is a sense of boundary of the self. There is a formation of the sense of the self that we are constantly making while we are growing up. And in some way, this leads to the divisive nature of the social fabric that we are in. And through a sensorial approach, I'm very interested in what this expansion can be. A lot of it is learning with artists, learning through practices that are experiences that are different from my own. And if I'm able to expand my boundary of what constitutes myself, I feel like then we're able to translate to a broader audience what this possibility for expansion could be. For me, one of the core questions within my practice is, how can I see both the separation and the unity at the same time? This comes from Nalanda scholar Nagarjuna's thinking, that can there be the dichotomy and can there be the unity at the same time? What does this mean in an everyday?
Thank you.
Thank you.